I knew exactly what she was doing the moment I saw that photo on the wall. It was the first thing you noticed when you stepped into the house, framed in gold and placed right above the fireplace like a quiet declaration of ownership. Daniel stood there with his arm around Vanessa, both of them smiling at the camera, sunlight catching in her perfectly styled blonde hair. It looked like a magazine cover, the kind you'd see in a real estate spread about young couples building their dream life from the ground up. What it didn't show, what it very carefully avoided, was me. I paused just inside the doorway, holding the small housewarming gift I had picked out 2 weeks earlier, something simple but thoughtful, a crystal bowl I remembered Vanessa admiring once. My reflection flickered faintly in the glass of that photograph, distorted and faint, like a ghost that didn't belong. "Mom, you made it," Daniel called from across the room, his voice warm but distracted, already turning back to greet another guest before I could respond. Vanessa appeared a moment later, her smile bright and practiced, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She kissed the air near my cheek and took the gift from my hands with a quick, efficient motion. "We're so glad you could come," she said, her tone light, almost rehearsed, as if I were just another name on the guest list. Not Margaret, not Mom, just someone who could come. I smiled, because that's what I've always done. I stepped further into the room, letting the noise of polite conversation and soft music wash over me. But my eyes kept drifting back to that photograph. It wasn't just what was missing. It was what it replaced. 35 years of raising my son, of working double shifts to keep a roof over our heads after his father passed, of saving every extra dollar so he could go to college without debt. All of it had been reduced to a blank space on a wall that now told a different story. Their story. And as I stood there, watching Vanessa glide from group to group, introducing Daniel as if she had been there from the very beginning, I began to notice the pattern. "Daniel worked so hard for this place," she was saying to a couple. Near the kitchen, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "He really built everything himself." I felt something settle quietly in my chest, not sharp or sudden, but slow and certain, like a truth finally coming into focus. No mention of the down payment I had helped with. No mention of the years I had supported him when he was starting out. Just a clean, polished narrative that left no room for me. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and held it in my hands, listening, observing, letting each word fall in a place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. No one questioned her. Why would they? The house was beautiful, the story was convincing, and I stood there looking exactly like what she wanted me to be, an aging mother visiting her son's success, grateful just to be included. I took a slow sip, keeping my expression calm, my posture steady, because there was no reason to interrupt. Not yet. Not when she was doing such a thorough job revealing everything on her own. And in that moment, surrounded by soft laughter and clinking glasses, I understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't thoughtlessness or a careless omission. It was deliberate, careful, designed. I smiled again, softer this time, almost to myself, because she thought this was the beginning of her story. She had no idea it was the moment I finally saw the whole truth. I moved deeper into the house, letting the flow of guests carry me from one carefully staged corner to another, and everywhere I looked, I saw the same quiet pattern repeating itself. The living room was filled with people holding glasses of wine, admiring the high ceilings and the polished hardwood floors, and Vanessa moved among them like she belonged there more than anyone else, her laughter light and perfectly timed. "We wanted something open," she was saying to a group near the windows. Daniel has always had such a great eye for space. I watched as Daniel nodded beside her, smiling in agreement, his hand resting comfortably at the small of her back. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. They were presenting a united front, a seamless story, and there was no space in it for anything that came before. I stopped near the kitchen island, running my fingers lightly along the cool marble surface, remembering a different conversation from nearly a year ago when Daniel had stood in my living room, papers spread across my dining table, explaining how he was just a little short on the down payment. He had looked nervous then, hopeful in a way that made him seem younger than his 40 years. "I will pay you back, Mom," he had said, his voice earnest. I had waved it off, telling him that helping him get started was all that mattered. That moment had felt like a continuation of everything I had always done for him. Now, standing in his new kitchen, listening to Vanessa describe how they had made it happen on their own. I realized that moment had been rewritten into something else entirely. A woman beside me smiled politely and asked how I knew the hosts. I hesitated just long enough to notice it. Not curiosity, not warmth, just polite obligation. "I am Daniel's mother," I said, keeping my tone even. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, just for a second, before she nodded and turned back to the conversation as if that information did not quite fit with what she had been told. I took another sip of my drink, letting the silence settle around me. And that was when I heard Vanessa again, this time closer, her voice lowered just enough to sound intimate, but still clear enough to carry. "We have always been very independent," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "We really wanted to build something that was just ours." There it was again, that careful choice of words. Just ours. Not ours with help. Not ours with support. Just theirs. I felt a quiet shift inside me. Not anger, not even hurt, but something steadier, something colder. I began to understand that this was not about one story or one omission. This was about control. About shaping how people saw them and, by extension, how people saw me. I set my glass down gently on the counter and looked around the room again, this time not as a guest, but as an observer. The framed photos, the way Vanessa guided conversations, the subtle corrections she made when Daniel spoke, even the way she introduced him to new arrivals. Every detail had been considered, every piece placed exactly where she wanted it. And for the first time, I saw my absence not as an oversight, but as a decision. A deliberate, quiet removal. I folded my hands in front of me, steady and composed, because there was still more to see, more to understand, and I had learned long ago that the truth reveals itself most clearly when you are willing to stand still and watch. It was not just the words she chose, it was the way people responded to them. I noticed it in the small pauses, the quick nods, the polite smiles that carried just a hint of assumption behind them. They believed her. Of course they did. Why would they not? She sounded confident, effortless, as if she had lived every part of the story she was telling. I moved toward the hallway where a series of framed photographs lined the wall, each one carefully spaced, each one telling a version of their life together. Weekend trips, holiday dinners, smiling faces in places I had never been invited to. I slowed my steps, letting my eyes linger on each frame, searching without quite knowing what I was looking for, until I realized what it was. There was not a single photo of me. Not one. Not from birthdays, not from holidays, not even from the day Daniel graduated, a moment I had held on to for years like proof that everything I had done had mattered. It was as if I had never existed in the story they were building here. "Beautiful, is it not?" a voice said gently beside me. I turned to see an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, holding a glass of red wine and studying the wall with quiet interest. "They have done a wonderful job with the place." I nodded, offering a small smile. "Yes, it is very well put together." He glanced at me, then back at the photos. Vanessa was telling us how they started from scratch. Very impressive these days. There was no accusation in his tone, no malice, just simple admiration shaped by the story he had been given. I felt the weight of that realization settle deeper than anything else had so far. It was not just that I had been removed. It was that something else had been put in my place. A cleaner version. A simpler version. One that made everything easier to explain. I let out a slow breath, keeping my expression composed. "Yes," I said softly. "She does tell it that way." The man smiled politely and excused himself, drifting back toward the living room where laughter rose and fell like background music. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of one of the frames. The glass was cool, smooth, untouched by time or memory, just like the story it held. Behind me, I could hear Vanessa again, her voice lifting slightly as she gathered attention. "We could not have asked for a better evening," she said, and there was a soft ripple of agreement from the guests. I turned slowly, watching as she stood near the center of the room, Daniel beside her, both of them glowing under the warm lights. "This house means everything to us," she continued, her hand tightening around his. "It represents what you can achieve when you stay focused and rely on each other." There it was again, that phrase. Rely on each other. I watched Daniel this time, really watched him, searching for any sign that he might correct her, that he might add something, anything, to acknowledge the truth. But he only smiled, his expression calm, agreeable, as if he had already accepted this version of their life as the only one that mattered. Something quiet and final settled into place inside me then. Not shock, not confusion, just clarity. I understood now that this was not just Vanessa's story. It had become his as well. And as the room filled with applause and congratulations, I stood there, still and composed, realizing that the person I had raised was standing in a life where I no longer existed, except as a distant, optional detail that could be included or erased depending on what suited the narrative best. Applause faded into soft conversation again, and I remained where I was, letting the moment pass without joining it. I had learned something important in the last few minutes, something that could not be undone by a polite correction or a quiet reminder of the truth. This was not a misunderstanding that needed to be fixed. It was a version of reality that had already been accepted by everyone in the room. I walked slowly toward the dining area where a long table had been arranged with small plates and carefully labeled dishes, each one presented as if it belonged in a catalog. Vanessa stood near the center again, explaining the layout to a group of guests. "We really wanted everything to feel intentional," she said, gesturing lightly. "Every detail reflects who we are and what we have built together." I paused just outside the circle, listening, and for a moment, I almost admired the precision of it. Not a single word out of place. Not a single detail that contradicted the image she was creating. It was not loud or aggressive. It was quiet, consistent, and repeated often enough that it became truth to anyone hearing it for the first time. I picked up a small plate and placed a few items on it, more out of habit than hunger, and found a seat near the edge of the room where I could see everything without being seen too closely. From there, the pattern became even clearer. Vanessa guided conversations with subtle shifts, redirecting whenever someone asked Daniel a question that might lead to the past. If someone mentioned how long it must have taken to save for a home like this, she would step in with a smile and say, "We have always been very disciplined," before Daniel could answer. If someone complimented the neighborhood, she would add, "We knew exactly what we wanted, and we made it happen." Always we, always us. Never anything that existed before their partnership. I watched Daniel carefully, noticing the way he followed her lead without hesitation, the way his responses shortened when she was near, as if he had learned to stay within the lines she had drawn. It was not forced. That was what made it so effective. It was practiced, rehearsed in small moments long before tonight. I set my fork down, realizing I had not taken a single bite, and folded my hands in my lap. A memory surfaced then, uninvited but clear. Daniel sitting at my kitchen table years ago, exhausted from working 2 jobs, telling me he did not think he would ever get ahead. I had placed my hand over his and told him that things take time, that he was not alone, that we would figure it out together. That word had meant something different then. Together had included me. Now, it had been redefined into something smaller, more exclusive, something that only existed between him and Vanessa. I looked across the room at them again, standing side by side, perfectly aligned in posture and expression, and I understood that this was not just about removing me from a story. It was about replacing the foundation of that story entirely. The past had been edited, simplified, reshaped into something that supported the image they wanted to present. And the more I watched, the more I realized that correcting it in this moment would not change anything. It would only make me appear out of place, emotional, perhaps even resentful. Exactly the kind of role that would fit neatly into the narrative Vanessa had been building. I lifted my glass again, steady and composed, and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to settle on my face, because the truth did not need to be forced into the room. It only needed time. And I was beginning to see that time was something I still had, even if my place in their version of the story had already been quietly erased. I stayed seated a little longer, letting the rhythm of the room settle into something predictable, something I could read without effort. Conversations rose and fell, glasses clinked softly, and laughter came in polite waves that never quite reached where I was sitting. It would have been easy to leave then, to slip out quietly with a simple goodbye and let the evening continue without me. That would have been the version of me they expected. The one who did not question, who did not disrupt, who accepted whatever space she was given and remained grateful for it. But I did not move. Instead, I stood slowly and walked back toward the hallway with the photographs, drawn again to the absence that had spoken louder than anything else in the house. This time, I looked more carefully, not just at what was missing, but at what had been included. There were dates printed in the corners of some frames, small and discreet, marking trips and milestones. I noticed how they all began roughly around the same time, a little over 3 years ago, just after Vanessa had entered Daniel's life. Before that, there was nothing. No evidence of birthdays, no record of family gatherings, no trace of the years that had come before. It was not just that I had been removed. It was that the timeline itself had been reset. She is very particular about what goes up there, a quiet voice said behind me. I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, someone I vaguely recognized from earlier in the evening. She offered a small, knowing smile. I asked her once if she had any older family photos. She said they did not really fit the aesthetic. The word lingered for a moment. Aesthetic. I nodded slightly, letting that settle into place alongside everything else I had noticed. It is a beautiful wall, I said, my tone even. The woman hesitated, then stepped a little closer, lowering her voice just enough to feel private. For what it is worth, I have known Daniel through work for years, she said. He used to talk about you all the time, about how you helped him get started, how you never let him give up. I met her eyes then, searching for any hint of exaggeration, but there was none. Just simple honesty. That sounds like him, I replied softly. She gave a small nod, as if she understood more than she was saying, then excused herself and returned to the living room. I stood there for a moment longer, my gaze moving once more across the line of carefully chosen images, and something shifted inside me again. Not in the way it had before, not a quiet realization or a slow understanding, but something firmer, more defined. Confirmation. This was not just something I felt. It was something that had been constructed, piece by piece, in a way that others could see if they looked closely enough. I reached out and adjusted one of the frames by the smallest fraction, straightening it even though it was already perfectly aligned. It was a simple gesture, almost automatic, but it grounded me in a way I needed. I turned back toward the main room, where Vanessa's voice carried again, light and confident, weaving through conversations like a thread that held everything together. Daniel stood beside her, still smiling, still playing his part without hesitation. I walked back in with the same calm expression I had worn all evening, but the way I saw the room had changed. I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I already knew. And once you know something like that, truly know it, you stop reacting to it. You start watching for what comes next. I let the room come back into focus as I stepped fully into it again, no longer searching for what was wrong because I had already found it. Now I watched for something else. Patterns had a way of repeating themselves when people believed no one was paying attention, and Vanessa had grown very comfortable in the role she had created for herself. I moved closer to a small group gathered near the back patio doors, where the evening light filtered in and softened everything it touched. It was quieter there, easier to hear the details in people's voices. Vanessa joined the group moments later, carrying a tray of drinks, her movements smooth and deliberate. I swear, we barely slept during the whole process, she said with a light laugh as she handed out glasses. There was so much to handle, but we did it all ourselves. Every decision, every detail. A man beside her nodded in admiration. That is impressive. Most people need a lot of help with something like this. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, smiling in a way that looked humble on the surface but carried something sharper underneath. We just wanted to make sure it truly reflected us, she replied. I stood just close enough to hear every word, my presence acknowledged with a polite glance, but not fully included. It was a familiar position now. Present, but not part of the story. I noticed the way Daniel shifted his weight slightly, as if he might speak, but then stopped himself. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it told me more than anything he could have said out loud. He had learned when to stay quiet. The conversation moved on, drifting toward design choices and neighborhood details, but I remained where I was, letting the earlier words settle. Every decision, every detail. The certainty in her voice left no room for interpretation. It was not just that she believed the version she was telling. It was that she had practiced it enough to make it sound unquestionable. I stepped outside onto the patio, needing a moment away from the carefully controlled air inside. The evening was cool, the kind that carried just a hint of early fall, and I drew in a slow breath, letting it steady me. Through the glass doors, I could still see them. Vanessa at the center of another conversation, Daniel beside her, both of them framed by the warm glow of the house that had been built on more than just their efforts. A man joined me outside, closing the door softly behind him. He leaned against the railing, looking out toward the quiet street. "Beautiful place," he said after a moment. I nodded. "It is." He hesitated, then added, "I have worked with Daniel for a few years now. He is a good man." Always seemed very grounded. There was something in the way he said it that made me turn slightly toward him. Not doubt, but curiosity. "He is," I replied. The man glanced back toward the house, lowering his voice just enough to carry a different weight. He used to talk about how his mother helped him through everything when he was starting out. Said he would not have gotten here without her. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then gave a small, composed smile. "He did say that," I answered quietly. The man nodded, as if confirming something for himself, then excused himself and went back inside. I remained where I was, looking through the glass at the life unfolding in front of me, and I understood something with absolute clarity. Vanessa was not just telling a story for tonight. She had been telling it for a long time, in small conversations, in casual remarks, in carefully chosen words that shaped how people saw their lives. And now, standing outside that house, separated from it by nothing more than a pane of glass, I realized that the real shift had already happened long before this evening. Tonight was not the beginning. It was the result. I straightened slightly, smoothing my hands together in a slow, deliberate motion, because once you recognize the pattern, you no longer wonder if it will continue. You begin to anticipate where it leads. I stayed outside for a moment longer than necessary, letting the cool air settle around me, but my attention remained fixed on what I could see through the glass. Inside, nothing had changed. Vanessa continued moving from group to group with the same ease, her voice rising and falling in carefully measured tones, while Daniel followed her rhythm without resistance. It would have been easy to think of it as simple confidence, as a woman proud of what she and her husband had accomplished. But I had seen too much now to accept it at face value. There was structure behind it. Intention. I stepped back inside quietly, blending into the movement of guests returning to the main room, and this time I did not drift aimlessly. I positioned myself where I could hear without being drawn into conversation, where I could watch without being watched too closely. Vanessa was speaking again, this time to a couple near the dining table. "We had a very clear vision from the beginning," she was saying. "We knew exactly what we wanted our life to look like." The words were simple, almost harmless on their own, but I heard what was underneath them now. A life defined by choice, by control, by a version of events that left no room for outside influence. I noticed how she used the same phrases, the same structure, repeating them just enough to make them familiar, just enough that no one questioned them. It was not random. It was practiced. And then I saw something else. A small moment, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. A woman asked Daniel directly about the early days of saving for the house, her tone curious and genuine. For a second, just a second, he looked as though he might answer differently. His posture shifted, his mouth opened slightly, and I felt a quiet stillness settle in my chest. But before he could speak, Vanessa's hand touched his arm, light and almost affectionate. "It was definitely a journey," she said smoothly, stepping just half a step forward, placing herself between him and the question without making it obvious. "We had to be very disciplined." The woman nodded, satisfied, and the moment passed. Just like that. I watched Daniel close his mouth again, his expression returning to that same agreeable calm, and something inside me settled even further into place. This was not just about telling a story. It was about controlling which parts of the truth were allowed to exist in front of other people. Redirecting, reframing, repeating until there was no space left for anything else. I lowered my gaze briefly, then looked back up, my attention sharper now, more focused. Every gesture Vanessa made had a purpose. Every interruption was subtle enough to go unnoticed, but precise enough to guide the outcome. And Daniel, whether he realized it or not, had adapted to it. He had learned to move within the boundaries she set. That was the part that mattered most, because it meant this was not something I could correct with a single conversation or a moment of honesty. It was something that had been built over time, reinforced in ways that felt natural to everyone except the one person being removed from the picture. I shifted slightly, adjusting the sleeve of my jacket, my movements slow and deliberate, because there was no urgency in what I was feeling now. No impulse to confront or to explain. Just clarity. I understood the shape of it. I understood the direction it was going. And as I watched Vanessa smile at another guest, her voice light and confident, I realized that she believed this version completely. She believed she had already secured her place at the center of everything that mattered. I let a small, controlled smile form on my lips, not for anyone else to see, but for myself. Because the moment you understand how something is built, you also begin to see how it can be undone. I remained where I was, no longer shifting from one space to another, no longer searching for anything new to confirm what I already understood. The room had settled into a rhythm that repeated itself with quiet precision, and Vanessa stood at the center of it, exactly where she had positioned herself to be. The conversations had grown warmer, more relaxed, and that was when patterns became even easier to see. People stopped questioning. They stopped listening closely. They simply accepted what was being presented. I moved toward the kitchen again, this time deliberately, my steps unhurried, my posture composed. Vanessa noticed me as I approached, her smile widening just slightly as if she had remembered something she needed to include. "Margaret," she said, her voice bright enough to draw attention from the small group around her. It was the first time she had used my name all evening. The timing was not accidental. "Have you seen the backyard yet?" she continued, gesturing lightly toward the sliding doors. "We are planning to redo the whole space next spring. It is going to be beautiful." I met her gaze for a brief moment, long enough to see the calculation behind the invitation. It was not about showing me anything. It was about directing me somewhere else, moving me out of the center of the room, away from the conversations she was controlling. "I am sure it will be," I replied calmly. I did not move. The pause that followed was small, almost invisible, but I felt it ripple through the group. Vanessa recovered quickly, her smile never faltering, and turned her attention back to the others. "We have so many plans," she added, her tone light again. "We just have to stay focused." Stay focused. I recognized the phrase now, not just as part of her story, but as part of her method. Keep everything aligned. Keep everything controlled. I reached for a glass of water, my movement steady, and let my attention drift across the room one more time. Nothing here was spontaneous. Every element supported the same idea, the same narrative, the same carefully built image of independence and self-made success. And yet, the more consistent it became, the more fragile it felt to me. Because consistency like that required constant effort, constant reinforcement. One shift, one unexpected detail, and the entire structure could begin to show its seams. I turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the hallway again, the photographs lined up in perfect order, the story displayed without interruption. It would not take much to disrupt that. Not a confrontation. Not an accusation. Just something small. Something undeniable. I let that thought settle without acting on it, because timing mattered more than anything else. Vanessa believed she was in control because everything was going according to her plan. She believed the story was complete because no one had challenged it. But I had seen enough to know that control like that was never as solid as it appeared. It depended on silence, on agreement, on the absence of anything that did not fit. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip, my expression unchanged, my presence steady, because I did not need to force anything tonight. I only needed to understand it completely. And as I stood there, surrounded by voices that echoed the same version of events, I realized that the most powerful thing I could do was not to interrupt the story, but to let it continue exactly as she had designed it, until the moment came when the truth could no longer be ignored. The evening began to settle into its final shape, the kind that comes when guests have grown comfortable enough to linger, but aware enough to begin thinking about leaving. Coats were mentioned, plans for the week exchanged, and the soft hum of conversation shifted into something looser, less structured. Vanessa still moved through it all with the same careful ease, but I noticed the subtle changes now. The repetitions had slowed. The phrases were shorter. She no longer needed to explain as much because the foundation had already been laid. People believed what they had heard. They would carry it with them when they left, repeated in their own words, and the story would continue without her needing to be present. That was how it worked. That was how something like this spread. I stood near the edge of the room, my hands resting lightly around my glass, watching as one couple thanked Vanessa for the evening. "You have built something really special here," the woman said warmly. Vanessa smiled, her expression softening just enough to feel sincere. "That means a lot," she replied. Daniel stood beside her, nodding, his silence now part of the pattern rather than an exception to it. I waited until the couple moved on, until the space around them opened just slightly, and then I stepped forward. Not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, just enough to be included in the natural flow of the moment. Vanessa turned toward me, her smile already in place, ready to greet, ready to guide. "Margaret," she said, her tone light, almost welcoming. "Did you enjoy the evening?" It was a simple question, harmless on the surface, but I heard what was behind it. A closing, a final placement of me within the role she had assigned. I held her gaze for a moment, calm and steady, then let a small, measured smile form. "It was very enlightening," I said softly. The word hung there, quiet but precise, and, for the briefest second, something in her expression shifted. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just a flicker. Daniel glanced between us, his smile faltering slightly, as if he sensed something he could not quite define. I let the moment pass without pressing it, without adding anything more. There was no need. I had already seen what I needed to see. I picked up my coat from the chair near the door, smoothing the fabric with slow, deliberate movements, and turned back once more toward the room. The laughter, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated images all remained exactly as they had been. Perfect, controlled, complete. And yet, as I stood there, I no longer felt the need to fit into any part of it. I stepped toward the door, pausing just long enough to look at Daniel. He met my eyes, something uncertain flickering there, something that had not been part of the evening until now. I offered him a small nod, not cold, not distant, just measured, and then I looked at Vanessa one last time. She held her smile, steady and composed, exactly as she had all night. I returned it, just as controlled, just as calm, because she believed the story was finished. She believed every piece was in place. I reached for the door, feeling the cool air from outside brush lightly against my skin as it opened, and as I stepped out into the quiet of the night, I understood something with absolute certainty. She had spent all this time deciding what would be remembered. She had never considered who might still be watching.